This is Professor Michael Chapman. I'm one of the most experienced IVF doctors in Australia. I believe that an important part that I can contribute is to educate patients in relation to fertility, infertility, and all that involves. These series of podcasts help to educate you. I hope they are helpful to you. If you wish to know more, however, I'm more than happy to have you contact me via email, which is profmchapman@gmail.com, or make an appointment to see me on 9138 4222.
The genetic testing of embryos, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. The first steps in this are now 25 years old, when techniques relating to genetic analysis were actually very crude. But it did enable us to test for some chromosome abnormalities and determine that an embryo has the right number of chromosomes. And that meant that we could select or put back only embryos with the right number of chromosomes. Why would we bother? Well, as science has developed and our techniques have got better, we have become much better at counting the normal numbers of chromosomes in a particular embryo. And if we do that, it means that the odds of a pregnancy per embryo transfer jump quite substantially. For instance, no matter what your age is, if we put, well, that's not quite true. It does totally depend on age. Let me start that again. If you are a 35-year-old woman, and we put back an untested embryo, your chances of success are around about 35% per embryo transfer. If we had tested that embryo and only put it back because it had the normal 46 chromosomes, then your chances of a pregnancy jump to 50 to 60% per single embryo transfer. So that sounds like it would be worth doing on every embryo that we produce, because it would produce a better pregnancy rate in the first transfer. The downside of that argument is that even if we hadn't tested them, eventually we would have got to the embryo that was genetically normal. So, in fact, the ultimate pregnancy rate from that group of embryos is not going to be any different. It's just that we'll get to it earlier. And the advantage of getting to it earlier is that women aren't going through multiple cycles if they produce multiple embryos, multiple cycles where the embryo was doomed before it started. And there's a financial implication of that, but also the stress involved in each of those cycles, where if we'd known what the genetics was, we wouldn't have done it, and therefore it minimises that stress. So the issues around genetic testing of embryos is that while its accuracy is very high, probably 98-99%, there's also, it's not totally black and white, and we end up with another group of embryos in which there's a mixture of cells that are genetically normal and abnormal, called a mosaic. And that gives us a headache, and the patient a headache when that happens, knowing what exactly, should we be putting it back or not. So, and then the other issue is that it's not an inexpensive procedure. So for every embryo we test, we're probably looking at an outlay of $700, $800, $900 per embryo. So there's that as a deterrent. Although if you have a collection of embryos, particularly if you're in your, I mentioned 35 with a 50-50 chance of being genetically normal. When you're 40, it's now 70% likely that it's abnormal. So if you are lucky and you've got 5 embryos, it's likely that 3 of the 5 are going to be abnormal. And if you can save, let's say it costs $700 an embryo, that's a $3,500 investment to find the best 2 on average, best 2 embryos, but you probably saved yourself $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000 by not putting embryos back in that were abnormal and would never have succeeded. So, there is a financial argument for doing it. The other plus or minus is that there is a chance of losing an embryo in the process. So what the process involves is on day 5, when there's 200 or 300 cells of the embryo, we take away 10 of them. Under the microscope, we chop out 10 cells and send them off for testing. It's moderately invasive, and therefore potentially it might damage an embryo. Then we have to freeze the embryo while we wait for the result to come back, and then we have to thaw it before it gets transferred a month or so later. In all of those steps, there's something like a 2 or 3% chance that we might lose an embryo that's a good embryo. So again, perhaps a negative to doing it. So with those pros and cons, the statistics in Australia are that the overall genetic testing of embryos is around about 15 to 20% of all embryos. It's not by no means universal. Interestingly, in the United States, there are clinics that 95% of their embryos get tested. Obviously, there's a financial incentive for the clinic to encourage that. And instead of in Australia, where you might be $2,000 out of pocket to doing a frozen embryo transfer, it's more like $5,000 or $6,000. It then starts to become a financial argument to not put back genetically abnormal embryos, because they don't have, in most states, don't have the Medicare subsidies that we have in Australia. So the pre-implantation genetic diagnosis is scientifically proven to be useful over the age of 38. Under 38, there's been a big randomized study that suggested that it really made no influence on the chances of a pregnancy. In the over 38s, probably it is worthwhile. And the older you get, provided you've got enough embryos to test, it's probably a good idea.
And don't forget that you can access all the previous episodes by going to our website www.theivfjourney.com and select IVF Journey podcast from the navigation menu.